The cedar walk at Thornfield Manor was not particularly long, perhaps 60 feet from the main garden to the small ornamental gate that opened onto the lane beyond, but in those few moments of shocked silence that followed Dr. Whitmore's cry, it seemed to stretch into an infinite distance of consequence and possibility. Miss Marple moved with practiced unhurriedness through the gathered guests, who had begun to cluster together in small, anxious groups, their social instincts suddenly inadequate to the situation confronting them. She could hear fragments of shocked conversation as she passed, someone suggesting it must be a prank, another insisting they heard genuine distress, a third wondering whether the rector's brother had experienced some sort of medical emergency. But she paid them little attention, having learned many decades ago that initial reactions to crisis were often more reflective of the speaker's own anxieties than of any objective reality. The cedar walk itself was lined with tall hedges on both sides, creating a cool green corridor that seemed almost deliberately designed to conceal whatever happened within its bounds from the view of anyone remaining in the main garden. It was into this enclosure that Miss Marple proceeded, moving at her own measured pace, neither hurrying nor dawdling, projecting the air of an elderly lady simply following the path of events rather than deliberately investigating them. What she discovered, when at last she rounded the slight curve in the walk that brought the cedar's gnarled trunk into full view, was the body of Nicholas Harrington, Mrs. Eleanor's grandson and the village's most promising young professional, lying face down on the gravel path, with what appeared to be a substantial portion of his skull, crushed in by a force that suggested considerable violence and intent. Dr. Whitmore was kneeling beside the body, his face a study in controlled horror, his medical training apparently wrestling with the obvious fact that no amount of professional expertise would resurrect the young man whose blood was now darkening the pale gravel beneath him. Standing at some distance from the body, her face drained of all color, was Vivian Whitmore, the rector's daughter, her hands trembling visibly and her eyes fixed on Nicholas's form with an intensity that spoke volumes about the nature of their recent conversation near the punch bowl. Behind her, having apparently followed Dr. Whitmore into the walk, stood Thomas Whitmore himself, the rector, his expression struggling between compassion for his distressed niece and the shock of witnessing sudden death in a place where nothing more violent than the occasional heated discussion of parish matters typically occurred. Miss Marple's eyes moved with deliberate slowness across the scene, cataloguing details with the precision of someone who understood that first impressions, however fleeting, often proved most reliable. The weapon, if indeed there had been a distinct weapon, was not immediately visible on the ground around the body, though a particularly heavy stone that formed part of the garden's decorative border appeared to have been recently displaced from its position and now sat several feet from where it logically belonged. The cedar tree itself bore a suspicious dark smudge on one of its lower branches at approximately the height one would expect if a person had attempted to grip something for support or balance after receiving a severe blow. Most intriguingly, the wicker chair that Miss Marple had observed in its slightly displaced position only moments before was nowhere to be seen in the cedar walk, though its absence might reasonably be explained by the fact that no chairs had ever been placed in this particular section of the garden to begin with. It was into this scene of controlled chaos that Constable Harris, the village's sole police officer, rather breathlessly arrived, having been hastily retrieved from his bicycle patrol by one of Mrs. Harrington's household staff, who had run directly from the garden party with news of the catastrophe. He was a competent enough man for the typical requirements of village policing, but his face made abundantly clear that he had never before encountered a situation of such magnitude, and his first instinct was to clear the scene and preserve it for more senior officers who would inevitably be summoned from the county town. Miss Marple, observing his attempts to establish order, quietly removed herself to stand near the hedge border, making herself as unobtrusive as possible while maintaining a clear view of the body and of the various faces surrounding it. It was a skill she had developed over many years of living in small communities, This ability to become nearly invisible while seeing everything, to ask few questions while learning vast amounts, to appear to be a harmless elderly woman engaged in the modest pursuit of understanding while in fact being engaged in something considerably more complex and demanding. Dr. Whitmore was speaking in low tones to the rector, explaining that based on the position of the wound and the force required to inflict it, death would have been nearly instantaneous, that Nicholas could not have suffered, which was perhaps meant to be comforting, but which instead simply underscored the finality of what had occurred. Vivian Whitmore had begun to weep silently, her earlier shock giving way to genuine grief, and Thomas moved to place a protective arm around his daughter's shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that seemed inadequate to the magnitude of the moment. It was at precisely this point that Mrs. Eleanor Harrington appeared at the entrance to the Cedar Walk, having apparently overcome her initial shock sufficiently to investigate the crisis affecting her garden party with her own eyes. Her face registered the truth of the situation in stages. First confusion, then comprehension, and finally a kind of frozen denial that suggested her mind was still attempting to process the impossible fact that her carefully planned afternoon had been transformed into a scene of genuine tragedy. Behind her came several other guests who had followed, drawn by the terrible magnetism of catastrophe, and Constable Harris found himself forced to make increasingly firm requests for everyone to return to the main garden and await further instruction from officers who would be arriving within the hour. By the time Detective Inspector Reginald Ashford arrived from the county town, the garden party had taken on the peculiar atmosphere of a gathering that had fundamentally lost its purpose, the refreshment tables now abandoned and slightly grotesque in their untouched abundance, the string quartet having departed some 30 minutes previous in a state of considerable bewilderment, and the guests confined to the main garden under Constable Harris's increasingly uncomfortable supervision. Inspector Ashford was a man of perhaps 60 years, with the methodical bearing of someone who had spent 3 decades observing human behavior under conditions of stress and deception, and he immediately set about establishing a preliminary timeline and securing statements from those who had been present at the moment of discovery. He established his initial operations in Mrs. Harrington's drawing room, a space of considerable elegance that seemed incongruous as the setting for a murder investigation. And it was here that the various threads of the afternoon's events began to be untangled through the careful questioning of witnesses whose recollections were still relatively fresh and unclouded by the natural tendency of memory to distort itself according to the narrative one wished to believe. Miss Marple, having been cordially invited to remain by Inspector Ashford himself, who seemed to recognize in her an observational capacity that might prove useful, seated herself in a corner of the drawing-room with her knitting once more, presenting the image of an elderly woman engaged in needlework while in fact absorbing every detail of the investigation's unfolding architecture. Inspector Ashford's first interviews were necessarily with those who had been nearest to the scene when the body was discovered, beginning with Dr. Whitmore, whose medical knowledge qualified him to provide authoritative testimony regarding the nature and probable timing of death. The doctor reported that Nicholas had been dead for not less than 10 minutes and not more than 30 when discovered, a time frame that encompassed the period during which the garden party had been in full progress, meaning that the murder had occurred while numerous people circulated through the garden grounds, yet somehow with sufficient discretion that no one had witnessed the actual event or heard sounds suggestive of violent struggle. This particular detail seemed to trouble Inspector Ashford considerably, suggesting, as it did either, considerable planning or remarkable luck on the part of whoever had wielded the weapon. Next came Thomas Whitmore, the rector, whose testimony regarding his niece's movements and emotional state proved somewhat rambling and complicated by his evident distress at the death of a young man he had known since birth, but whose essential facts remained clear. Vivian had been speaking with Nicholas near the punch bowl at approximately 3 o'clock. Their conversation had seemed animated and intimate in nature, and when a guest had remarked to the rector that he ought to check on his daughter as she seemed unusually agitated, He had proceeded toward the refreshment area, only to encounter his brother arriving at the Cedar Walk with apparent urgency. When questioned more closely regarding what had motivated Dr. Whitmore's sudden departure to the Cedar Walk, Thomas found himself unable to provide a satisfactory explanation, reporting only that his brother had seemed distressed and that he had not thought to inquire into the reason before tragedy intervened. Vivian Whitmore's statement, taken with considerable gentleness given her obvious emotional distress, revealed that she and Nicholas had been discussing their relationship, which apparently had progressed to a point where more formal commitments were being contemplated, though family opposition from various quarters had complicated matters considerably. She insisted she had left Nicholas in the Cedar Walk only moments before his body was discovered, departing to return to the main garden in order to compose herself before resuming social interaction, and that she had heard no sounds of violence or struggle whatsoever. Her tears seemed genuine, her grief unperformed, yet Miss Marple's experienced eye noted a certain careful quality to the way Vivian's narrative was constructed, as though she were relating facts she had carefully rehearsed in her mind before speaking them aloud. Geoffrey Ashford, the village solicitor and younger brother of the inspector, presented himself for questioning with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to dealing with legal matters and formal procedures, his timeline of movements throughout the afternoon proving to be remarkably precise and well documented through multiple corroborating witnesses who could confirm that he had remained in the main garden throughout the relevant period, engaged in conversation with various guests and notably absent from the Cedar Walk area entirely. His wife, Margaret, corroborated his testimony while simultaneously offering observations regarding the behavior of other guests, particularly noting with some precision the exact moments when various individuals had excused themselves from social interaction, which suggested either a woman of considerable observational capacity or one possessed of a particular motivation to document the movements of those around her. Mrs. Eleanor Harrington provided a statement confirming the basic facts of the garden party's organization and timeline, though her obvious shock at the violent intrusion into her carefully orchestrated afternoon made her account somewhat disjointed and unreliable regarding precise timings. She was able to confirm that Nicholas had been among the guests throughout the afternoon and that he had indeed been observed near the refreshment area at the approximate time the rector had mentioned. As the afternoon advanced toward evening, Inspector Ashford began to construct a preliminary framework of motive and opportunity, though he seemed puzzled by the apparent absence of adequate motive in a young man who, by all accounts, was well-liked, reasonably successful, and engaged in no obvious disputes with anyone of significance in the village. It was at this point that Constable Harris entered with information that would shift the direction of the investigation substantially, reporting that a search of the garden grounds had uncovered a rather substantial sum of money, nearly £300 in cash, concealed in a tin beneath a loose stone near the Cedar Walk's entrance, and that this discovery raised considerable questions regarding Nicholas Harrington's financial circumstances and his possible involvement in activities that required the maintenance of hidden resources. The discovery of the concealed money seemed to crystallize Inspector Ashford's previously diffuse investigation into something more focused and purposeful, and he immediately requested that Mrs. Eleanor Harrington provide detailed information regarding her grandson's financial circumstances, living arrangements, and any debts or obligations that might have necessitated the maintenance of hidden monetary reserves. Mrs. Harrington's response was notably uncomfortable, her carefully maintained composure fractured by the revelation that her grandson apparently possessed financial resources she had been unaware of, and she was forced to admit that while Nicholas's solicitor position provided adequate income for a comfortable lifestyle, she had never concerned herself particularly with the specifics of his personal finances, assuming them to be properly managed according to the standards expected of a young professional. This admission seemed to trouble her considerably, as though the murder itself might somehow be partially attributable to her failure to maintain adequate awareness of her grandson's activities, a psychological response that Miss Marple recognized as typical of those confronted with sudden tragedy in connection with someone for whom they bore some familial responsibility. Inspector Ashford's next line of inquiry naturally led to Geoffrey Ashford, Nicholas's employer and brother of the detective himself, creating the somewhat awkward situation of an inspector conducting a formal investigation into the affairs of a family member, which Geoffrey handled with commendable professionalism while simultaneously making clear his considerable displeasure at the implication that his employee might have been engaged in some form of financial impropriety. Geoffrey insisted that Nicholas's work performance had been exemplary, his handling of client matters meticulous and beyond reproach, and that he had no knowledge of any personal financial difficulties that might explain the presence of hidden money on his employer's property. When pressed regarding whether Nicholas might have been involved in activities outside his legitimate professional practice, Geoffrey became visibly tense, suggesting that such inquiries were inappropriate and that unless Inspector Ashford possessed evidence of specific wrongdoing, he ought to confine his questions to matters directly related to the circumstances of death rather than engaging in character assassination of a young man who could not defend himself. The inspector's expression suggested he had anticipated precisely this response, and was not particularly troubled by it, but Miss Marple observed that he made a careful note in his investigation book, indicating that Geoffrey Ashford's defensive reaction had registered as significant in some manner she could not yet fully comprehend. It was Margaret Ashford who provided the first truly illuminating piece of information, having apparently observed something during the afternoon that she had not previously considered relevant to the investigation, but which the discussion of Nicholas's financial circumstances had prompted her to recall. She reported, with evident reluctance and obvious awareness that her testimony might reflect poorly on her husband's judgment as an employer, that she had observed Nicholas on several occasions meeting with individuals who did not appear to be solicitor clients, the meetings having taken place in the vicinity of the village green and involving transactions of some kind that suggested financial exchange. When asked whether she could identify these individuals, Margaret acknowledged that she recognized one of them as a man named Marcus Dewell, who had acquired a small cottage on the village outskirts approximately 6 months previous and who maintained a rather mysterious lifestyle that had generated considerable gossip among those predisposed to such speculation. This revelation seemed to strike Inspector Ashford with considerable force, and he immediately instructed Constable Harris to locate Marcus Dewell and bring him in for questioning, issuing the instruction with a tone suggesting he possessed prior knowledge of this individual, or at least his reputation. While awaiting Dewell's arrival, Inspector Ashford continued his systematic questioning of the various guests who remained at Thornfield Manor, and it became increasingly apparent that Nicholas Harrington's life had contained considerably more complexity than his relatively straightforward professional surface might have suggested. Several guests reported observing tensions between Nicholas and various other individuals at the garden party, though the nature of these tensions remained obscure, involving nothing more dramatic than pointed looks, brief conversations conducted in lowered voices, and what one observer characterized as a general atmosphere of underlying strain that seemed to permeate Nicholas's interactions with multiple people. Most significantly, Constance Blackwell, the postmistress, reported that she had observed Dr. Whitmore speaking urgently with Nicholas in the garden approximately 40 minutes before the body was discovered, the conversation apparently being of considerable importance and conducted with such intensity that neither party seemed aware of their surroundings, suggesting matters of genuine consequence rather than mere social pleasantries. When this information was relayed to Dr. Whitmore, he initially denied any significant conversation with his young relation, but when pressed with specific details regarding timing and location, he reluctantly admitted that he had indeed spoken with Nicholas regarding a matter of some personal importance, though he declined to specify the nature of this matter, citing professional confidentiality and the irrelevance of the discussion to the present investigation. His obvious discomfort with the questioning, however, suggested that whatever had been discussed carried implications that the doctor was anxious to conceal from general village knowledge, and Miss Marple's experienced eye noted that he touched his cufflinks repeatedly during this exchange. a nervous habit she recognized as consistent with someone attempting to maintain composure under considerable emotional strain. By the time Marcus Dewell arrived at Thornfield Manor in the company of Constable Harris, having been located at the public house in the village and escorted rather ceremoniously through St. Crispin's streets in a manner guaranteed to ensure that word of his arrest would circulate through every household by morning, the garden party atmosphere had been entirely replaced by something grimmer and more urgent, and the drawing room had taken on the character of an informal courtroom where the complicated secrets of a small community were being methodically exposed to light and scrutiny. Marcus Dewell was not quite what Miss Marple had anticipated based on the rumors and speculation that had circulated through St. Crispin's gossip networks, proving to be a man of perhaps 40 years with the bearing of someone accustomed to operating in circumstances where deception and careful self-presentation were essential survival skills, his demeanor suggesting neither particular guilt nor innocence, but rather a kind of practiced neutrality designed to reveal nothing of genuine consequence to observers. He carried himself with a confidence that seemed almost provocative given the circumstances of his summons, and he responded to Inspector Ashford's initial questions with a composure that suggested either genuine innocence or considerable experience in managing interactions with law enforcement authorities. When asked directly regarding his relationship with Nicholas Harrington, Dewell readily admitted to knowing the young solicitor and to having engaged in several financial transactions with him, characterizing these interactions as business arrangements of a perfectly legitimate nature involving the rental and eventual purchase of the cottage where Dewell currently resided. Inspector Ashford's skeptical expression suggested he found this explanation inadequate, but Dewell remained unmoved, insisting that if the inspector wished to investigate his financial affairs more thoroughly, he would be more than happy to provide documentary evidence supporting the legitimacy of all transactions, adding with what seemed like calculated insolence that unless specific charges were to be laid against him, he preferred not to be detained further from his evening activities. It was at this precise moment that Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care and rose from her chair with the careful movements of an elderly woman whose joints required consideration before significant exertion, drawing the attention of everyone present in the drawing-room through the simple act of changing position. Inspector Ashford turned toward her with an expression that seemed to recognize her movement as significant rather than merely physical, and Miss Marple offered an apologetic smile before making her way to where Inspector Ashford stood, requesting in a low voice whether she might ask Mr. Dewell a question of a purely technical nature that had occurred to her during his testimony. The inspector, intrigued by this request and apparently recognizing in Miss Marple's demeanor a quality worthy of consideration, granted permission with evident curiosity regarding what line of inquiry an elderly woman might pursue that would prove relevant to a murder investigation. Miss Marple approached Marcus Dewell with the gentle hesitance of someone uncertain of her welcome, apologizing for the intrusion but inquiring whether Mr. Dewell might clarify a small point that had confused her regarding the timeline of his property acquisition, specifically whether the cottage purchase had been completed through Mr. Geoffrey Ashford's legal practice or whether alternative legal representation had been engaged for the transaction. The question seemed almost innocent in its specificity. Yet Dewell's reaction suggested it had struck something of significance, his composure wavering fractionally before he responded that the transaction had indeed been handled by Mr. Ashford's firm as a matter of convenience, Geoffrey having approached him regarding potential business opportunities in the area. This response prompted Inspector Ashford to request that Dewell provide specific dates and documentation regarding these arrangements, and the detective's tone suggested that he was suddenly pursuing a line of inquiry that had not previously occurred to him, one that apparently involved his own brother's professional activities in connection with the deceased. Over the following several hours, as the evening descended into night and Thornfield Manor's drawing-room took on the quality of a sealed space where truth and deception intermingled in increasingly complex patterns, a picture emerged that suggested Nicholas Harrington had been engaged in something considerably more elaborate than simple financial transactions with village outsiders. Geoffrey Ashford, when confronted with specific questions regarding his legal handling of Marcus Dewell's property acquisition and whether such transactions had generated unusual financial arrangements for himself personally, became visibly agitated and demanded to speak with Inspector Ashford privately, a request that was granted despite the obvious protocol violations it represented. The subsequent private conversation, though conducted in an adjacent room with the door closed, apparently generated considerable tension, as evidenced by the raised voices that occasionally penetrated the intervening barrier and by Geoffrey's flushed appearance when he finally emerged, his earlier confidence replaced by something more akin to defiant resignation. When he resumed his place in the drawing room, Geoffrey made a formal statement to the effect that he had indeed received financial benefits from his handling of certain transactions involving Marcus Dewell, and that these arrangements had been facilitated through Nicholas Harrington's introduction, though he insisted that all such arrangements had been conducted according to proper legal procedures and that any suggestion of impropriety was entirely unfounded. Dr. Whitmore's face, upon hearing this revelation, seemed to age considerably, and he rose from his chair with the stiff movements of a man whose entire worldview had been fundamentally disrupted, his expression suggesting that the conversation he had conducted with Nicholas in the garden had apparently concerned precisely these financial arrangements, and that his recent failure to disclose this information now appeared considerably more culpable. It was at this moment that Vivian Whitmore, who had remained in the drawing room throughout the investigation despite the emotional toll it clearly exacted, rose from her seat and walked directly to where Inspector Ashford stood, her face composed but her eyes suggesting resolution born of some internal struggle that had reached its conclusion. She requested permission to provide an additional statement, and when granted, she revealed that Nicholas had mentioned to her during their conversation near the punch bowl that he was deeply troubled by the financial arrangements his employer had become involved in and that he was contemplating taking action to expose them, though he had expressed considerable anxiety regarding the personal and professional consequences such disclosure might generate for various individuals. The revelation that Nicholas had been contemplating exposure of financial impropriety seemed to fundamentally reorient the investigation's trajectory, transforming what had initially appeared to be a crime of passion or opportunistic violence into something with considerably more calculated dimensions, a murder motivated by the necessity of silencing someone whose conscience had begun to outweigh his willingness to participate in questionable arrangements. Inspector Ashford's expression suggested he recognized this shift immediately, and he turned his attention with renewed focus toward those individuals who possessed both motive and opportunity to prevent Nicholas from taking action that would expose their activities to official scrutiny. Geoffrey Ashford, recognizing the implications of this new information for his own legal position and professional reputation, began to offer increasingly detailed explanations of his involvement in the financial arrangements, characterizing himself more as a victim of Nicholas's manipulation than as an active participant in impropriety, though his protestations seemed to ring increasingly hollow given the documented evidence of his financial enrichment through the disputed transactions. Marcus Dewell, for his part, maintained his earlier composure, but requested explicitly that he be permitted to leave the premises, claiming that he had answered all relevant questions and that further detention constituted unlawful imprisonment unless specific charges were to be filed against him, a request that Inspector Ashford denied with the quiet authority of someone conducting an active murder investigation. The tension in the drawing room had by this point become almost palpable, a quality of underlying violence held in check only by the presence of law enforcement authority and the social conventions that continued to constrain behavior even under such extraordinary circumstances. Miss Marple, having resumed her position in the corner with her knitting, continued to observe with the quiet attention she had maintained throughout, and her needles moved with steady rhythm as though nothing of particular significance had occurred, though her eyes missed nothing of the various reactions and interactions that continued to unfold around her. Dr. Whitmore, having heard his niece's testimony regarding Nicholas's expressed intentions, moved from shock into something more closely resembling genuine distress, and he made his own supplementary statement to the effect that his conversation with Nicholas in the garden had indeed centered on the young man's expressed intention to disclose the financial irregularities to the appropriate authorities, and that he, Dr. Whitmore, had attempted to dissuade Nicholas from this course of action by explaining the severe personal and professional consequences such disclosure would generate not only for Geoffrey Ashford, but for others who had become involved through no particular malice, but rather through circumstance and opportunity. The implications of this statement seemed to strike Inspector Ashford with particular force, and he requested with evident significance that Dr. Whitmore clarify precisely which others he was referring to, and what their nature of involvement might have been. Dr. Whitmore's response was slow in coming, and when it finally emerged, it carried the quality of a confession extracted against considerable internal resistance, the doctor acknowledging that he himself had received financial benefits from the arrangements Nicholas had facilitated. Modest amounts, certainly, but sufficient to have influenced his judgment regarding the appropriateness of Nicholas's proposal to expose the entire scheme to the authorities. This admission, delivered with evident humiliation and genuine shame, seemed to transform the doctor's status in the investigation from a peripheral figure offering medical expertise into someone with substantial personal motive to prevent Nicholas's planned disclosure, a transformation that was not lost on Inspector Ashford or on the various other parties assembled in the drawing-room. It was at this critical juncture that Margaret Ashford made an observation that seemed to catch everyone's attention despite its apparent casualness, remarking that she had noticed throughout the afternoon that Dr. Whitmore had appeared unusually anxious and distressed, far more so than could be explained by normal social interaction or even by awareness of questionable business arrangements. More specifically, she recalled that when she had encountered the doctor near the garden's central path at approximately the time the murder was believed to have occurred, he had appeared to be arriving from the direction of the cedar walk rather than departing from it, and that his hands had carried traces of what appeared to be soil or garden earth, despite his otherwise immaculate appearance. This testimony, seemingly minor in isolation, acquired considerable significance when considered in conjunction with the timeline established through earlier questioning, suggesting that Dr. Whitmore had possessed both motive and opportunity to commit the murder, his presence in the cedar walk being explicable through his stated intention to speak with Nicholas regarding the threatened disclosure. Inspector Ashford's entire demeanor seemed to shift at this point, and he began to direct his questioning with renewed intensity toward the doctor, asking with careful precision whether he might explain the presence of soil upon his hands, and whether he acknowledged being in the cedar walk at the time of Nicholas's death. Dr. Whitmore's response was initially defensive, suggesting that the soil could have accumulated through any number of innocent activities in a garden environment. But when pressed more directly regarding whether he had encountered Nicholas in the cedar walk and whether some form of altercation had occurred, the doctor's resistance began to crumble visibly, his face showing signs of genuine emotional distress that seemed to suggest internal conflict between his desire to maintain innocence and his recognition that the accumulated evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to deny or explain away through recourse to alternative narratives. The moment at which Dr. Whitmore's emotional resistance gave way to something approaching capitulation was marked not by any dramatic outburst or confession, but rather by a kind of hollow resignation, his shoulders seeming to collapse inward, as though the weight of accumulated secrets and deceptions had finally exceeded his capacity to maintain the fiction of innocence that he had constructed throughout the preceding hours. Inspector Ashford, recognizing the significance of this shift in demeanor, signaled for Constable Harris to position himself near the drawing-room's only exit, while maintaining his questioning with a tone that suggested he was offering the doctor an opportunity to provide his own narrative of events, rather than allowing them to be constructed entirely from fragmentary evidence and third-party testimony. Dr. Whitmore's account, when finally delivered, emerged in halting fragments punctuated by long silences and evident emotional struggle, painting a picture of a man whose professional judgment had been progressively compromised by financial arrangements that had begun innocuously but had evolved into something substantially more ethically problematic than he had initially recognized or been willing to acknowledge. He described his conversation with Nicholas in the Cedar Walk as having begun with his attempt to persuade the young man that disclosure of the financial irregularities would constitute a disproportionate response to what he characterized as essentially harmless business accommodations that had harmed no one and which could be rectified through simple cessation of the questionable arrangements without necessity for official investigation or legal consequences. When Nicholas had refused to be dissuaded, insisting that ethical principles transcended personal or professional convenience and that concealment of impropriety was itself a form of corruption, Dr. Whitmore had apparently experienced something approximating genuine panic, recognizing suddenly and with terrible clarity that his reputation, his standing in the community, his entire carefully constructed professional identity faced imminent destruction through the agency of a young man who seemed to possess both moral conviction and stubborn determination in equal measure. The doctor's description of what had followed was notably imprecise regarding critical details, his account focusing instead on emotional states and general impressions rather than specific actions or causal sequences. But the essential outline seemed clear enough despite these ambiguities. He acknowledged that some form of physical altercation had occurred, that Nicholas had apparently begun to move away from him in the direction of the main garden, presumably to return to where he might speak with Inspector Ashford or another authority figure capable of receiving his disclosure, and that in response to this movement, Dr. Whitmore had acted with what he characterized as instinctive desperation rather than premeditated intent. His language regarding the actual moment of violence remained deliberately vague, involving phrases such as, "I did not intend," and "it seemed to happen almost without my conscious participation." Constructions that suggested either genuine psychological dislocation regarding the act of violence or a carefully rehearsed narrative designed to minimize his culpability by characterizing the murder as an accident born of panic rather than deliberate homicide. Inspector Ashford listened to this account with the practiced attention of someone accustomed to parsing the complicated relationship between what suspects claimed happened and what physical evidence suggested actually occurred, and he interrupted with specific questions regarding the stone that had been discovered near Nicholas's body and whether the doctor acknowledged using it as a weapon. Dr. Whitmore's response to this inquiry seemed to strike something like genuine horror into his features, as though he had been attempting to maintain a version of events in which the violence remained somehow abstract or diminished in nature, and the specific acknowledgement of the stone as the instrument of death seemed to force him to confront the concrete reality of his actions in a manner his earlier testimony had attempted to avoid. His eventual admission that yes, he had lifted the stone, that yes, he had struck Nicholas with it, that yes, he understood that this action had caused the death of a young man whose only transgression had been a commitment to ethical principles, seemed to drain whatever remaining capacity for denial he possessed, leaving him diminished and hollow in his chair. His earlier professional bearing entirely stripped away to reveal someone fundamentally broken by the consequences of his own choices. As Dr. Whitmore offered this confession, Miss Marple observed that Vivian Whitmore had begun to weep silently once more, but these tears seemed to be born of a different emotion than her earlier grief. Something more complicated that incorporated not only loss, but also a kind of grim vindication, as though some part of her had suspected or known something of her uncle's involvement in the financial arrangements that had troubled Nicholas so deeply. Inspector Ashford's response to the doctor's admission was to caution him regarding his legal rights and to inform him that he was formally placing him under arrest pending more detailed investigation and preparation of charges related to the death of Nicholas Harrington. a declaration that seemed to settle over the drawing room like a physical weight, transforming what had been an investigation into something more definitively concluded, and yet simultaneously opening up larger questions regarding the nature of justice, accountability, and the extent to which good intentions or professional standing could serve as mitigating factors when set against the reality of a deliberate act of violence. The removal of Dr. Whitmore from Thornfield Manor's drawing room seemed to extract something essential from the atmosphere that had accumulated throughout the day, as though the confession and arrest had drained away the tension that had sustained the investigation's momentum and left in its place a kind of hollow exhaustion that affected everyone present with the weight of anticlimactic resolution. Inspector Ashford, however, seemed oddly unsettled by the conclusion that appeared to have been reached, his expression suggesting that while the confession provided a plausible account of the murder's mechanics, something in the accumulated evidence and witness testimony continued to generate small dissonances that prevented him from achieving the kind of complete satisfaction that typically accompanied the identification and apprehension of a murder suspect. He dismissed most of the remaining guests with instructions to remain available for potential further questioning, retaining only those individuals whose involvement seemed most directly connected to either the victim or the accused, and it was at this point that Miss Marple found herself invited to remain in a private conversation with the inspector, an invitation she accepted with her characteristic graciousness while carefully preserving the demeanor of an elderly woman who had merely happened to observe events unfold rather than having engaged in any systematic investigation of her own. Inspector Ashford's opening question to Miss Marple was notably direct, asking whether she found the confession and Dr. Whitmore's account to be entirely consistent with her observations throughout the afternoon, a query that seemed designed to elicit her assessment rather than to provide information he himself might not possess. Miss Marple's response, delivered with careful consideration and appropriate hedging language that preserved the appearance of uncertainty while actually offering quite specific observations, suggested that while she certainly possessed no expertise in criminal investigation or forensic matters, there seemed to be certain small inconsistencies in the doctor's account that might warrant additional exploration if one were inclined to pursue such matters to their ultimate conclusions. When pressed by Inspector Ashford to specify what inconsistencies she was referencing, Miss Marple proceeded with her characteristic method, offering observations about human behavior based on her extensive experience of village life and the consistent patterns of human nature rather than about the specific facts of the present case, suggesting that in her observation, people who committed acts of violence under genuine panic or desperation typically exhibited certain physical and emotional manifestations that seemed, at least to her untrained eye, to be somewhat absent from Dr. Whitmore's demeanor and testimony. More specifically, she observed that when individuals acted against their essential nature under pressure, they typically experienced what she characterized as a kind of internal fragmentation that manifested itself through hesitation, contradiction, and a profound difficulty in articulating the sequence of events with the degree of coherence that Dr. Whitmore had managed, his narrative having demonstrated a somewhat troubling consistency and organization that suggested it had been formulated and considered in advance rather than being reconstructed from genuine memory of spontaneous action. This observation seemed to strike Inspector Ashford with considerable force, and he rose from his chair to pace the drawing room while apparently working through the implications of what Miss Marple had suggested, his expression suggesting that the confession, while providing a convenient resolution to the investigation's formal requirements, had apparently triggered precisely the kind of doubt and uncertainty that had initially troubled him. He requested that Miss Marple elaborate on her observations regarding the hidden money that had been discovered near the Cedar Walk, asking whether she possessed any thoughts regarding why an individual committing a spontaneous act of panic-driven violence would have taken the time and presence of mind to conceal monetary resources in a location adjacent to the scene of the murder, a detail that seemed to argue for considerably more premeditation than a desperate doctor acting under emotional duress would typically display. Miss Marple's response acknowledged the cleverness of this observation while suggesting, with characteristic gentleness, that the presence of hidden money might indicate that the murder had involved considerably more complex motivations than the simple desire to prevent disclosure of financial impropriety, and that perhaps the financial arrangements that had been discussed throughout the investigation constituted merely one layer of a considerably more intricate web of secrets and deceptions. At this point, Inspector Ashford seemed to reach some internal resolution, and he informed Miss Marple that while he appreciated her observations and respected her analytical capacity, the formal investigation appeared to have achieved sufficient resolution to warrant the filing of charges and the initiation of judicial proceedings against Dr. Whitmore, and that additional speculation regarding alternative motivations or more complex scenarios would constitute an indulgence in the kind of theoretical uncertainty that practical police work necessarily overcame through the application of empirical evidence and reasonable conclusions. Yet even as he delivered this statement, his tone and expression suggested that he was delivering a professional conclusion while simultaneously acknowledging to Miss Marple, through subtle indirection and carefully calibrated language, that he recognized the possibility of deeper complexities that the formal investigation might not have fully resolved. It was as Miss Marple prepared to depart Thornfield Manor for her home in St. Crispin that she encountered Geoffrey Ashford in the manor's entrance hall, his expression suggesting a man whose entire worldview had been fundamentally disrupted by the events of the afternoon and evening, and whose professional and personal status had been considerably compromised by the revelations regarding his involvement in financial impropriety. He seemed to recognize in Miss Marple a certain sympathetic understanding, and he moved as though to speak with her, his mouth opening and closing several times, before he apparently thought better of whatever he had intended to say, and simply stepped aside to allow her passage, a gesture that nonetheless conveyed considerable meaning in its hesitant quality and evident emotional struggle. The night following the investigation at Thornfield Manor descended upon St. Crispin with the peculiar quality that small villages acquire when they have been touched by tragedy and violence, a sense that the familiar patterns of daily life had been fundamentally disrupted and that ordinary routines no longer possessed their accustomed meaning or comfort. Miss Marple, having returned to her cottage and having consumed a modest dinner prepared by her housekeeper, found herself unable to settle into her usual evening activities, her mind continuing to circle back to the various details that Inspector Ashford had apparently accepted as constituting sufficient evidence of Dr. Whitmore's guilt, yet which seemed to her experienced eye to contain certain logical inconsistencies that warranted further consideration. She sat in her small study with a cup of tea that had grown cold beside her, her knitting needles idle for once, and allowed her thoughts to trace through the accumulated observations of the day with the methodical precision that had served her so well in understanding the complicated motivations and deceptions that typically underlay surface appearances in small communities. The question that seemed to circle most insistently through her mind concerned the precise mechanics of how Dr. Whitmore, if indeed he had acted spontaneously under panic, would have managed to conceal the substantial sum of money in so systematic and deliberate a fashion, and moreover, why he would have possessed such a sum in the first place, a detail that seemed to require explanation, but which had not apparently occupied any significant portion of the formal investigation's attention. Additionally, the behavior of certain individuals at Thornfield Manor throughout the afternoon and evening continued to suggest patterns that seemed inconsistent with the straightforward narrative of a crime of passion committed by a doctor desperate to prevent disclosure of financial impropriety. Marcus Duell, in particular, seemed to Miss Marple to have maintained, throughout his questioning, a degree of composure and studied indifference that argued either genuine innocence or a psychological capacity for deception substantially exceeding what one would typically anticipate in someone whose business arrangements had been thrown into legal jeopardy by a murder investigation. By the following morning, after a night of considerably less sleep than she would have preferred, Miss Marple determined that she would engage in a series of inquiries, conducted with her characteristic subtlety, beginning with a visit to the village's small library, where she maintained a long-standing acquaintance with Miss Eleanor Pritchard, the librarian, who possessed an extensive knowledge of local history and maintained access to various documentary resources that might illuminate the backgrounds and histories of the key individuals involved in the investigation. Through Miss Pritchard's mediation, Miss Marple was able to access property records and financial documents that revealed certain interesting details regarding Marcus Doole's acquisition of his cottage. Specifically, that the property had previously been owned by an individual with connections to organized gambling operations in London, and that the sale price had been substantially below market value, suggesting either unusual circumstances or arrangements that extended beyond the simple transfer of property ownership. More intriguingly, Miss Marple discovered that Dr. Whitmore himself had maintained a financial interest in the property through a somewhat obscured legal structure, suggesting that his involvement in the questionable financial arrangements extended considerably beyond the passive receipt of modest monetary benefits that he had described to Inspector Ashford. Armed with these discoveries, Miss Marple determined that she would arrange a private conversation with Marcus Duell, achieving this through the seemingly innocent mechanism of encountering him by apparent chance at the village green, where he had apparently taken residence in a small rented room pending the resolution of the police investigation. Her approach was characteristically oblique, beginning with a pleasant inquiry regarding his adjustment to village life and his observations regarding the unfortunate events at Thornfield Manor. Conversational openings that seemed to put Duell somewhat at ease by suggesting that she was engaged in nothing more substantial than the kind of social pleasantries that typically characterized village interaction. Once she had established this context of casual conversation, Miss Marple proceeded with remarkable delicacy to introduce the subject of property investment and local real estate matters, commenting on the general difficulty of acquiring desirable properties at reasonable prices and wondering aloud whether Mr. Duell had been particularly fortunate in his acquisition, a remark that seemed to trigger a notable reaction in Duell's previously composed expression. When pressed gently regarding the circumstances of his property purchase and his business relationship with the now deceased Nicholas Harrington, Duell's initial reluctance to elaborate gradually gave way to a more candid discussion in which he revealed that Nicholas had indeed facilitated his acquisition of the property through arrangements that extended considerably beyond simple legal representation, and that these arrangements had involved a degree of financial creativity that might not withstand particularly close scrutiny by tax authorities or other regulatory bodies. The conversation that followed, conducted with Miss Marple's characteristic patience and gentle persistence, gradually revealed a far more complex picture than the investigation had apparently established, suggesting that Nicholas Harrington had been engaged not merely in facilitating questionable business arrangements for Geoffrey Ashford, but in managing a considerably more elaborate financial operation that involved multiple parties and that had generated tensions far more profound than simple disagreement regarding ethical principles. Duell eventually acknowledged, in what seemed to be a reluctant but genuine confession, that he had observed certain transactions that suggested Nicholas might have been contemplating not merely disclosure of the financial arrangements to authorities, but rather something more threatening to the various parties involved, potentially including blackmail or the threat of selective disclosure designed to pressure certain individuals into providing him with financial advantages in exchange for his silence. This revelation, while not directly implicating Duell in the murder itself, suggested that the investigation's conclusion regarding Dr. Whitmore might have been substantially premature, and that the true motives underlying Nicholas's murder might involve considerably more complex considerations than desperation to prevent professional embarrassment had seemed to account for. Armed with this newly acquired understanding of the considerably more complex motivations that might underlie Nicholas Harrington's murder, Miss Marple determined that she possessed sufficient grounds to approach Inspector Ashford with her findings though she proceeded with characteristic caution regarding how she might present information gathered through her own informal investigations, without appearing to suggest that professional police work had been somehow inadequate or misdirected. She requested a private audience with the inspector through the mediation of Constable Harris, and when they met in the small office that had been established at the village police station for purposes of the ongoing investigation, she presented her discoveries with careful attention, to appearing to offer merely observations and fragmentary information rather than suggesting any systematic investigation or challenge to the conclusions that had been reached through official channels. Inspector Ashford's reaction to her revelations seemed to shift progressively from polite attention to genuine concern, and he began to ask increasingly pointed questions regarding her sources and methodology, eventually pressing Miss Marple directly regarding whether she possessed evidence that might suggest Dr. Whitmore's confession had not been entirely candid or complete regarding his motivations and the sequence of events in the Cedar Walk. Miss Marple's response was characteristically careful, suggesting that she had encountered nothing that constituted definitive proof of anything beyond what had already been established through the formal investigation, but that her observations regarding human nature and her long experience of village life had generated certain questions that seemed to her to warrant additional exploration if one were inclined to pursue such matters with appropriate thoroughness. This somewhat oblique presentation seemed to strike Inspector Ashford with considerable force, and he rose from his desk to pace the small office while apparently working through the implications of what Miss Marple had suggested, his expression suggesting internal conflict between his professional obligation to accept the confession that had been provided and his recognition that the confession might not tell the complete or entirely accurate story of what had transpired. Eventually, the inspector returned to his desk and began making a series of telephone calls, through which he apparently arranged for certain documentation to be obtained from London and for additional inquiries to be initiated regarding the financial operations that Nicholas Harrington appeared to have been conducting through his position at Geoffrey Ashford's legal practice. Over the course of the following several days, as these additional investigations proceeded, a far more elaborate picture began to emerge of financial operations that extended considerably beyond simple business accommodations and appeared to involve something approximating organized crime connections and money laundering activities designed to conceal the origins of funds derived from illegal gambling and other illicit enterprises. Dr. Whitmore's role in these operations, when more carefully examined, appeared to have been somewhat more substantial than his initial confession had suggested, and the motivation for his presence in the Cedar Walk at the time of Nicholas's death seemed increasingly unlikely to have derived solely from concern regarding potential disclosure of relatively minor financial impropriety. Instead, it became apparent that Dr. Whitmore had apparently been summoned to meet Nicholas by Geoffrey Ashford, who had become aware of Nicholas's intention to cooperate with authorities investigating the financial operations and who had apparently determined that Nicholas constituted a threat sufficiently grave to warrant elimination. The doctor's subsequent actions, while they had culminated in Nicholas's death, appeared to have been undertaken at Geoffrey's behest, rather than from Dr. Whitmore's independent initiative. And the confession that the doctor had provided seemed to have been shaped by his desire to protect his younger brother from direct culpability in the murder, while simultaneously attempting to minimize his own legal exposure by characterizing his actions as desperate and unpremeditated, rather than calculated and deliberate. Inspector Ashford, confronted with these revelations and the mounting evidence that suggested a considerably more complex conspiracy than the investigation had initially uncovered, arranged for a series of additional interviews conducted with considerably greater intensity than had characterized his earlier questioning. And Geoffrey Ashford's previously maintained composure and confidence appeared to dissolve under the weight of accumulated evidence and the apparent certainty that his role in orchestrating Nicholas's murder was becoming increasingly documented and undeniable. By the time Geoffrey was formally arrested and charged not merely with complicity in the murder, but with operating an illegal financial enterprise in conjunction with Marcus Dewell and various London-based associates, The entire edifice of respectability and professional standing that had characterized the village's more prominent citizens seemed to have collapsed with remarkable speed, leaving behind it a landscape of exposed deceptions and betrayals that appeared to shake the community's fundamental assumptions regarding the nature of the people they had believed themselves to know. Miss Marple, having received a communication from Inspector Ashford thanking her for her assistance and acknowledging that her insights had proven instrumental in preventing what might otherwise have constituted a miscarriage of justice, found herself in the somewhat uncomfortable position of possessing knowledge regarding the case's resolution that extended considerably beyond what had been made public through the official investigation's conclusions. She was invited to attend a final meeting with the inspector during which he provided a more complete account of the criminal operations that had been uncovered and the various roles that individuals had played in the complex scheme that had ultimately resulted in Nicholas Harrington's death. And she listened with her characteristic quiet attention to revelations that painted a picture of systematic corruption and premeditated violence that rendered the small village's apparent tranquility and civility something substantially more fragile and illusory than most residents had apparently appreciated. The weeks that followed the formal arrests and charging of Geoffrey Ashford and Dr. Whitmore, with various offenses ranging from conspiracy to murder to financial crimes, passed with the peculiar quality that characterized small villages in the aftermath of exposure and scandal, a period during which the carefully maintained social structures that had governed St. Crispin's daily interactions seemed to require substantial recalibration in light of revelations that had fundamentally altered the community's understanding of its own residents. Miss Marple, having retreated to her cottage with her knitting and her observations, found herself receiving a series of visitors who came ostensibly to inquire regarding her health and to engage in ordinary social conversation, but who in reality seemed driven by a kind of compulsive need to discuss and process the extraordinary events that had transpired, as though repeated examination of the details might somehow render them more comprehensible or less troubling than they appeared when considered in silence. Vivian Whitmore, having apparently recovered from the immediate shock of learning that her uncle had been instrumental in the death of the young man she had loved, visited Miss Marple to express her gratitude for the elderly woman's role in ensuring that justice had been pursued thoroughly, and that the truth regarding the circumstances of Nicholas's death had been properly established, rather than being obscured by convenient confession and incomplete investigation. During this conversation, Vivian revealed that she had been made aware through conversations with Inspector Ashford of the full extent of Nicholas's concerns regarding the illegal financial operations that Geoffrey Ashford had been conducting, and that Nicholas had apparently been collecting evidence and preparing to make disclosures to appropriate authorities, a commitment to ethical principle that had apparently cost him his life, despite his youth and the considerable personal and professional consequences such disclosure would have generated. Margaret Ashford, Geoffrey's wife, presented a considerably more complicated figure in the aftermath of the investigation's conclusion, her earlier role as an observant and apparently helpful witness having been substantially complicated by revelations that she had apparently possessed greater knowledge regarding her husband's questionable activities than she had initially disclosed, and that her testimony had been shaped considerably by her own complex motivations involving both genuine concern for justice and a desire to distance herself from any suggestion of complicity in her husband's criminal enterprises. Miss Marple received her visit with her characteristic graciousness while simultaneously maintaining a certain emotional distance that seemed to convey, without words being explicitly spoken, that she understood Margaret's complicated position and the conflicting loyalties that had apparently motivated her behavior throughout the investigation. It was Dr. Whitmore himself who provided the most poignant and troubling of the conversations that Miss Marple conducted in the weeks following the case's formal resolution, the doctor having apparently been granted temporary release pending trial and having made his way to Miss Marple's cottage with the apparent intention of seeking some form of absolution or understanding from a woman whose perceptiveness he had come to respect despite the circumstances through which that respect had been developed. The doctor's account of his own involvement in the murder, delivered now with considerably greater candor than had characterized his formal confession, painted a picture of a man whose professional judgment and personal integrity had been progressively compromised through a series of seemingly small moral compromises that had accumulated into something substantially more serious than any individual decision might have suggested. He described his initial involvement in Jeffrey's financial arrangements as having been motivated by what he had characterized as innocent desire to assist a professional colleague in managing certain business matters, but which had gradually evolved into something requiring active participation in the concealment and facilitation of illegal activities. When Jeffrey had approached him in the garden at the moment of the party and had informed him that Nicholas intended to disclose the entire operation to authorities, Dr. Whitmore had apparently experienced a moment of genuine panic in which his capacity for rational judgment had been overwhelmed by recognition of the catastrophic consequences that disclosure would generate not merely for Jeffrey but for himself and for the various other individuals who had become entangled in the criminal enterprise. Jeffrey's suggestion that Dr. Whitmore speak with Nicholas and attempt to persuade him to remain silent had seemed at the moment like a reasonable and relatively benign action. But when Nicholas had refused and had moved to depart the Cedar Walk, Jeffrey's own panic had apparently manifested itself through a kind of psychological transfer of responsibility, his urgent whisper of, "He cannot be allowed to leave," apparently functioning as sufficient encouragement for Dr. Whitmore to commit an act that he had not consciously intended to undertake, but which had emerged from the desperate urgency of the moment with terrible inevitability. Miss Marple listened to this account with her characteristic patience and without judgment, though her expression seemed to convey understanding of the complicated psychological mechanisms through which ordinary people could be drawn into actions that fundamentally contradicted their own sense of themselves as moral beings. When Dr. Whitmore departed her cottage, Miss Marple walked with him to the gate, and at that moment she spoke directly to him for perhaps the first time in their acquaintance, suggesting gently that he possessed an opportunity through the forthcoming trial, and the years of imprisonment that would likely follow to construct some form of meaningful redemption through genuine acknowledgement of his culpability and through commitment to genuine ethical transformation. The final resolution came in the form of court proceedings that attracted considerable attention from the regional press and which resulted in Jeffrey Ashford receiving a sentence of life imprisonment for his role as the architect of both the criminal financial enterprise and the murder of Nicholas Harrington, while Dr. Whitmore received a substantially lesser sentence in recognition of his confession and his apparent genuine remorse, though one that nonetheless involved substantial years of incarceration as appropriate consequence for his participation in taking a human life. Miss Marple attended the final day of the trial and observed with her characteristic quiet attention as the verdicts were delivered and as the various individuals involved in the case were finally provided with whatever form of closure that justice proceedings could supply, recognizing as she did that true resolution of such matters rarely achieved the kind of complete and satisfying conclusion that people seemed to anticipate, but rather left behind accumulated sadness and the recognition that human weakness and moral compromise could destroy lives and communities with remarkable thoroughness.